Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, and today I'm going to talk about the books that I read during the month of May. So this is the second time I've had to film this video. The first time everything was like blurry and out of focus, and I also forgot to talk about one book, so I just said fuck it, I'm just gonna do it again, and I'm really annoyed about it. But if it sounds like I'm kind of going fast and rambling here, I just kind of want to get it over with. So this past month I read a total of 9 books. One of those books was a middle grade, 4 of those books were YA, and 4 more books were adult, also slash general audiences. I read a total of 6 fantasy books. That's not surprising at all. One book was a sci-fi, one book was a mystery novel slash historical fiction, and the other book was a horror novel. As far as how I read these books, 3 of these books were physically read, and I own all 3 of these physical copies. 2 of these books were read off of Kindle Unlimited. 3 books were listened via audiobook, and all those audiobooks were borrowed from my library, and I read 1 e-arc. So in total I read about 3,100 pages, give or take. So I had 1 DNF, 3 3-stars, 3 4-stars, 1 4.5 star, and then 1 5-star novel. So I'll start with the DNF. That was the Beekeeper's Apprentice by Laurie R. Caine. This is one of the books that I borrowed from my library, and I was listening to it on audiobook, and that's honestly the reason why I DNF'd it. I'm just not in the mood for audiobooks right now. The other audiobooks were a struggle for me to get through, so I didn't want to continue to push myself. That's the only reason why I did not finish this book. I also don't rate DNFs, just for myself, I don't do that. This novel is a kind of continuation on the Sherlock Holmes stories. I think this is a pretty long series. We follow I want to say she's Jewish, British American young girl. We meet her around 16, 15 years old, and she meets a really strange older gentleman, and pretty quickly she is able to tell that the man that she's talking to is Sherlock Holmes. He's famous, so everyone kind of knows him, and I'm pretty sure the entire series is just their mentor-mentee relationship. Again, she meets him pretty young, and I only got 25% of the way through. I'm pretty sure around the time that I put this down, the story, the mystery is about to start off, so I can't really talk about the story that much. I was enjoying it. I love Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm kind of biased that way. Our main character, I think her name is Mary, she meets Sherlock Holmes when she's fairly young. She's a teenager, and really quickly we fast forward through the first few years that they know each other, and pretty soon she's off to college. I think she goes off to Oxford, and I wish we got to see more of that relationship. This is a long series, so I'm sure the author kind of does a lot of flashbacks, and she talks about these first few years throughout the series, but I just wanted to see more of it considering this is the first in the series. So the book that I liked the least was unfortunately the arc that was sent to me either by the author or the author's team, and that is Unwritten by Alicia J. Novo. So this is a YA fantasy. I'm pretty sure it's the author's debut novel. It's the first in a series. I gave it 3 stars, and honestly it's a pretty generous 3 stars because I'm gonna try not to be super negative, but I really didn't like the majority of what I read here. In this story, we follow a young girl. Her name is Beatrix, I'm pretty sure. And Beatrix has always had a weird connection with books. She can hear them. They kind of whisper things to her. She's also kind of an outcast in her high school for various reasons. She gets bullied and stuff, which is normal for a main character. I will say though that there was kind of that not like other girls vibe with her, especially at the beginning, because she thinks that one of the main reasons why she gets bullied is because she reads a lot of books, and it's kind of girl, seriously. I'm pretty sure I'm not the only one who's kind of over the whole I get bullied because I'm nerdy and I like reading books. That's kind of it's not 2005 anymore. And then through a series of events she kind of gets thrust into this fantasy world that I can't pronounce the name. I don't know how to pronounce the name, but she gets thrust into this fantasy world, and this world is really unique. I've never really read something like this, but I'd be interested if you have kind of recommendations. But this world is basically this hub where every character that has ever been written about in a fictional sense exists, and this is the world where they all kind of come together and kind of hang out. So we meet characters like Elizabeth Bennet. We meet various forms of Sherlock Holmes because multiple authors have written Sherlock Holmes, stuff like that. That's pretty much the general plot. There's also some other kind of bad things going on, someone's doing some bad stuff, and our main character kind of gets in the middle of that plot. She's also kind of looking for her mother, who she thought was dead, but now she's not dead. Don't really know what's going on there. The only reason I'm giving this 3 stars is because from what I understood of the world, it is interesting, and I do wish it was like edited better. So the author did give us a lot of information on this world that she has created, but I feel like it was never really put to use. Like, sometimes it just felt like I was reading like off a vocabulary list, and the story would keep it pushing, and I was like, I still don't understand what the purpose of this world is. There was like guilds, for example, where if you were a character from a fantasy novel, you're part of like the fantasy guild or whatever. I also don't know what the purpose of guilds is. I also think there's some sort of like school setting that we didn't really see, and I don't know who gets to go to this school. Is it only like people with magic, like our main character? Because there's also characters from like contemporary romance worlds, and they don't have magic because they're not from fantasy novels. You know what I mean? Like, there's just like a lot that I couldn't wrap my head around because we were just getting pushed into like the plot. The plot itself also became messy in certain parts. So one example is our main character is taken to this world. She doesn't like stumble upon it like Narnia style. She is taken, and almost as soon as she gets there, and after she gets like tested or interviewed or whatever, the people who are in charge of this world like don't really know what to do with her, and they basically just want to kick her out again. And I'm kind of like, what? You like went through the trouble of like finding her and bringing her here, and now you're like, well, we don't know what to do now. Characters weren't really that interesting to me. Maybe there was one character that I really enjoyed. She was kind of from a like Jane Austen type esque novel. It did start off with a lot of promise, but I do think that, I'm sure this did have an editor, but I think it did need to go through a round of edits, a few more rounds of edits, because I think that whatever the author was envisioning, I wasn't getting it. That being said, there are a lot of like positive reviews, so maybe I was just like in a bad headspace, and maybe it was just me, I don't know. At least the cover's pretty, so it has like that going for it. Yeah. Another 3-star that I read this month was Glass Houses by Rachel Caine. I listened to this via audiobook from my library. It's a YA like paranormal vampire story. So in this story we follow a young girl. She's about 16 years old, and she's already going off to university. Again, I also got like Not Like Other Girls vibes. Mind you, this was published like, I want to say in the early 2000s. I remember seeing this like paperback cover everywhere around the time like Twilight was like popping off, so it's of that era. So our main character is 16 and she's going off to college. She's kind of like a genius, or she's like a gifted student, but she doesn't go off to like a better university. She stays in kind of like a small local Texas university, and like right off the bat she's getting bullied pretty relentlessly by a group of mean girls. I'm not so sure how I like the mean girls trope now in the year of 2021, but she's getting bullied by a bunch of mean girls. It's really weird that the bullying was like such a huge part of the story when I really wanted to focus more on the vampires, and we do focus on the vampires later on, like the later half of the book, but the bullying was like such a huge part, and it read like very high school like, which is always so weird because this is a university setting. I'll get to that later though. But she gets bullied, so she wants to find like housing off campus, and she finds a group of they're not teens, they're like early 20s like kids, and she wants to live with them. That's pretty much where the story starts. I want to say that there's like a few books in this urban vampire story. It's kind of like one of those like Mercy Thompson, Sookie Stackhouse, but like make it YA type stories. So I'm assuming they're all going to be like fast paced, kind of fun paranormal stories. That being said, I don't think this is going to be on my list of like urban fantasies that I want to keep up with. One of the issues that I did have with the story that I kind of alluded to was that she's getting bullied in university, which I'm sure still happens. You know, people still get harassed no matter how old they are, but it read very like high school drama because she's smart and nerdy. I haven't been to high school in like a hot minute, so I don't know like how that works nowadays, but I did go to university, and Maybe I'm wrong, but this is my experience. Honestly, no one really gives a shit if you are like the smart kid in class. That's kind of like the point to go to university, is to like quickly get your education and get out as fast as possible. That's a lot of people's mentality anyways. So she's getting like bullied because she's like a young nerd. I don't get it. As far as the vampire stuff, I did not expect the vampires to be a part of the story in the way that it was. I don't want to spoil it. I just assumed it was going to be like a group of vampires that are like low key in town. That's not what it was. It's almost kind of like secret societies, kind of open secret type vampires where people know but they don't talk about it. It's kind of like one of those types of stories, which I enjoy. It is also kind of like small town vibes, so that might be something that you enjoy as well. It was just like an okay average book. It wasn't fantastic, but it wasn't also like incredibly bad. So the one middle grade I read this month was The Strangers by Magaret, Peterson, Haddix. I gave this 3 stars. It kind of starts off like a mystery with a mystery element, and then it kind of goes into some sci-fi stuff. I listened to this on audiobook, borrowed the audiobook from my library. In this story, we follow 3 siblings. I think the youngest is around 6 or 7 and the eldest is around like 12 or 13. At the very beginning of the novel, their own mother starts acting a little strange, a little bit weird, and then their mother goes off on a business trip and doesn't really come back, and she's pretty much like radio silence. She's not calling her children even though they're very close. This is also a single parent household, so the father's not in the picture, so they're very close knit family, and the fact that the mother kind of just like ups and leaves suddenly and doesn't like call or text, it's a little off. That's pretty much the beginning of the story. Definitely the best part of the story is the children. I don't usually read from fairly young characters, and I did appreciate how the author didn't make them stupid, because while our main characters, being so young, don't know every little thing about the world, they can at least definitely tell that there's something wrong, right? Children are like empathetic. They can like tell that something's wrong without actually like knowing what is actually wrong. The children were definitely distinct enough that I wasn't getting confused when I was listening to the audiobook. At some point it started becoming more sci-fi, less mystery. I'm fine with genre blending, but it definitely felt at some point where it was like, well, this was a mystery story, but now it's like very sci-fi, and I feel like when those sci-fi elements were introduced, it kind of the pacing kind of changed completely, and it felt like a whole different story. It definitely wasn't bad, but I just wasn't as invested in it once that kind of sci-fi element, plot, pacing change happened. So one of the 4 stars I read this month was My Best Friend's Exorcism by Grady Hendrix. This was a very popular horror novel. It has been for the last few years. I've seen it around booktube for quite a while now. I gave this book 4 stars. The story is pretty self-explanatory. It's about 2 girls, they're best friends, and one of them starts acting very strange, and our main character thinks that her best friend is possessed. I've mentioned before how horror is definitely one of my favorite genres to like watch, but I don't get to read it as much, and I definitely want to make that change. I have to say that the friendship between these 2 girls kind of blew me away. Our main character is incredibly dedicated to this friendship that she has with her best friend, even when her best friend starts acting strange, starts acting like a very cruel person mid like possession, if you will. I could never do that. Like 100% honest, like I will drop you if you even do like half the stuff that her best friend did in this book. There's maybe like one instance where she was like doubting that friendship, but pretty much the entirety of the book she realized that her best friend needs her support, and the ending definitely made me like tear up a little bit. So it was a pretty good novel. Again, I gave it 4 stars. This book, however, did make me think about how I want contemporary authors to write in a historical setting. This does take place in the 80s, by the way. Going into it, I assumed that it would just have like those like fun like 80s references, kind of like how Stranger Things just like throws in like cool 80s stuff like for nostalgic purposes. However, when I was doing research, and by research I kind of just meant like going through like Goodreads reviews, I'd seen how some reviews mentioned certain aspects of the 80s that were brought up in this book, specifically things like Reagan Republicanism, the Satanic Panic, and the war on drugs, for example. I think the author integrated these themes in the plot and like the the dialogue well. There was one instance that kind of made me not necessarily like roll my eyes, but I was kind of like you could have done better, because I'm seeing you do better as I read this book. And that's when the author kind of brought up this jokey reference to the HIV/AIDS epidemic that was going on at the time. So it definitely wasn't a reference that was like inaccurate, because this was going on at the time. But the scene was basically our main character is hanging out with her friends outside of school, kind of just chilling like on the quad or whatever, and then one of them makes like a jokey reference to HIV/AIDS, and I thought that the author was gonna in some way like make some commentary on it in the same way that this entire book is a commentary. It almost felt like the author was like checking off a list, like I've talked about Satanism, drugs, and poverty, and then he kind of just made like a quick note on the epidemic. So that was kind of a little letdown. I'm not like canceling the book or whatever. I still give it 4 stars. If you're just looking for like a fun horror, this is fine. I guess maybe I went into this with a critical mindset, and maybe I'm being too critical. I guess that's how I want my historical fiction to be. It definitely doesn't have to be how you consume historical fiction, but if an author is gonna like address like the politics of an era, like especially the negative aspects of this era, I hope that they were like smarter about it and talk about it with some like nuance, or at least talk about it as opposed to just kind of referencing like, oh yeah, this is the 80s, let me just like throw in like a reference to like this epidemic, you know what I mean? I feel like I'm rambling, but I hope that kind of made sense. So I'm going to talk about the next 2 books as like one segment, because they're part of a series, and that is, I think, the Plated Prisoner series by Raven Kennedy. I did not expect to enjoy this as much as I did. The first book is called Gild, and the second one is called Glint. I read these on Kindle Unlimited. Like I said, didn't expect to enjoy them as much as I did. They're definitely not perfect. This is a fantasy romance as well as a King Midas retelling. In this story, we follow our main character Oren, and she is King Midas's like most precious possession. Oren doesn't see herself as a possession, but it's pretty obvious to the audience or the reader that she is an object to the king. In the first book, the king does some things that makes Oren question how he sees her, what her value is to him, and then that's kind of when we start to see Oren start to doubt this relationship that they've had. For some reason, when I first saw this novel, I assumed that it was like YA, but it definitely isn't. I don't know why I saw it and I thought YA, but it is an adult novel with adult content. I mentioned it was also a fantasy romance, so romance blooms elsewhere. So this is not necessarily a critique from me, but I do feel like some readers might kind of get tired of our main character's love for the king, because I mean from the get-go we can tell that this is like not a good relationship. He quite literally has convinced her that living in a cage, like an actual cage, is like the best for her. So there's like some kind of Stockholm syndrome gaslighting going on here, and it's definitely not healthy, and like I could tell, it's pretty obvious. The author's not condoning any of that, but it takes a while for our main character to kind of realize and go through this full process of like self-liberation and all that. I don't think it drags, but it does go into the second book. Like second book in, she still has a lot of feelings for the king. I understand that for some characters that it's gonna be harder to leave a relationship even if it is like abusive and manipulative. I'm enjoying it. I've realized that as far as romances go, I think I enjoy romances that are a lot more tense, that have a lot of darker themes, or at least just drama, as opposed to like lighthearted contemporary stuff. It's not a series that I'd recommend to everyone, or it's like a must read. There's a lot of adult themes. There's also sexual assault like on paper, so keep that in mind. So the book that I gave 4.5 stars this month was An Ember in the Ashes by Sabaa Tahir. I can totally understand the hype that this series has now. I really enjoyed this. So this kind of takes place in an empire that's kind of politically inspired by like the Roman Empire. One of the main characters that we follow, her name is Laya, and she's kind of part of a group of people that are like essentially like second class citizens. The treatment that they suffer under the Martial Empire is pretty disgusting and pretty cruel. At the beginning of the novel, her brother is accused of being a rebel, and he gets arrested and imprisoned, and he's Laya's only living family member left. So she actually goes to the actual rebellion and asks for help to break him out, and in return Laya will be a spy. She is going to like infiltrate the military school of this empire and like get insider information. The other main character that we follow is Elias, and he is a senior in this same military school. If he's not the best, he's one of the best students at this school, and at the very beginning of the novel he is planning to escape. Despite having a bright future ahead of him, he's kind of part of like a more like noble class within this empire. He wants no part of this life at all. He has a lot of sympathy, and he knows the things that his empire does is not right. He doesn't believe in them, so he wants to escape. And honestly, this is the type of empire that will like execute you for like the most minor infractions or whatever. Like, it's a pretty brutal place, and that's pretty much where our character's stories start. I think the author did a really good job at like conveying the anxiety that both of these characters must have felt, because they're both doing things that could get them executed, and I felt nervous for both of them. I couldn't decide which point of view I liked more. They're both really well done. I definitely know that this is going to be a series where the author is going to completely like ruin my emotions. Someone's gonna die, like 100%. I like know that's gonna be really good, but also really painful. And the one book I gave 5 stars this month was The Exiled Queen by Cinda Chima. I did a book haul recently where I talked about how I got this book and I had already finished it, and that's how you can tell that like I'm really enjoying this series and I love it, so I gave it 5 stars. I feel like I've been talking about this series a lot because I've been hauling the books, I've been putting on TBRs, and I've been reading them, so I've been wrapping them up. You know how it is. I've been talking about the series a lot. If by some chance you haven't seen my other videos, which you kind of should, I would recommend you do, but if you haven't seen them, we follow 2 characters. One of our main characters is Han, and he's an ex-thief, but at the beginning of the series he steals this amulet from a wizard. Amulets are essentially how wizards kind of get a lot of power. This amulet that Han steals has a lot of history, has a lot of power. He doesn't know this when he steals it, but now he's stuck with it. And then we also follow the crown princess of the queendom. Her name is Ryza. She's going through a lot of drama with her mother. Her mother's kind of pushing her to a marriage/consort relationship despite the fact that she's only turning 16. Ryza feels that she's too young to get married. She doesn't want to do that, and she also thinks that this may not have been the queen's idea. She thinks that someone might be manipulating her mother. So just a lot of political intrigue. It's really fun. There's also a lot of other drama going on around our main characters that they necessarily haven't kind of walked into yet. So it's a very much not only like a character-centric story, but we also kind of have to keep in mind what's going on around these characters, not necessarily just these characters. And I really enjoy that. I'm also strangely enjoying the romance. I don't always love romances in YA. Most of the time romances are irrelevant to me, but I'm actually really enjoying this one, and a few have bloomed by the end of the 2nd book, and I'm looking forward to seeing how that works out. I'm very optimistic. Really enjoying this series. I'm currently reading the 3rd book. This series is definitely like high on my list. So those are all the books that I read during the month of May. Please let me know what you thought of like anything that I talked about. I'd love to hear whatever you have to say in the comments down below. I will also link my social medias as well as some far more important links down below. Feel free to like, comment, or subscribe if you'd like. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Peace out.